So I've got Shelly, Director of Community Engagement and Voter Engagement, and certainly one of those community, engaging the community activities. So, Christina, we were very pleased to, so let me tell you what the school does as far as advocacy and putting people out there in the political arena and expanding the definition of social work role beyond the therapeutic clinical setting. So micro social workers and meso and macro social workers can all be involved in voter engagement. Christina and Holly will tell you why. Holly is a living example of your work as a social worker that definitely has a voter engagement component. And Christina, you're graduating in May with your MSW?
Yes.
And you are from a class of?
2017.
2017. Great. So with that, and do you know, maybe you could briefly introduce yourself and say, are we first year or second year? Let me start the tape before you do that. It started, never mind.
All right. I'm Krista. I am a second year MSW student. I'm graduating next spring with Christina.
I'm Corinne. I'm a first year student.
I'm Allison, first year student. Well, thank you again for attending. Like Pat said, yeah, I'm a second year MSW student. This voter engagement, Holly, I'll give you a second if you want to add anything about your introduction and maybe some of the work that you're doing right
Sure.
now.
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit more about the work that I'm doing in my portion, but Holly Nowak graduated in 2017 from the MSW program and started working full-time directly after my internship ended at the Coalition for Economic Justice last year, so I've been there about a year and a half now.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yes.
I know it's not going to pick up.
All right, I will do what I can.
Okay, so this voter engagement teaching came out of a teaching that I attended in June that was part of the NASW National Conference. I received a scholarship from the School of Social Work to attend the 3-day conference. And this was kind of the initial introduction, and it really set the tone too, honestly, for the whole conference. If you might remember, towards the end of June, there was a lot of discussion in Washington and nationally about legislation to separate children from families, detain children at the border. So this was actually happening during that week that certain votes were made in connection to that legislation. So there was a lot of talk about the importance of voter engagement, voting as social work. So some of the main takeaways that we hope that you will take with you from this presentation today is about voting, who's doing it, who's not doing it and why, the role of social media, the overview of state and local government, and the role of social workers in voter engagement. So we wanted to do a brief exercise. We did expect there to be a few more people, but this can totally work with everyone present. We just wanted everyone to start thinking about, kind of like if you think about like the cognitive behavioral triangle of thoughts, feelings, and actions. Yes. And so when you hear the word election, I don't know, maybe someone was just to start out with, when they hear the word election, what do they think? Or when they hear the word election, what do they feel? Just to kind of get you in the mindset of our conversation today.
I think of president.
Okay.
Controversy.
Okay.
Midterms.
Okay.
Like drama or a lot of work. Like there's a lot of conflict or people saying things about each other.
Okay. What are some feelings that are associated with these thoughts?
Rueful hope.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel standoffish, especially when I think of voting and elections and stuff. I don't like it.
Do you feel a difference, or do you think there's a difference between your thoughts and feelings as a professional, as your personal thoughts and feelings?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll kind of continue on with this a little bit later in the presentation. So again, like I was saying, I participated in a voter teach-in at Capitol Hill. So this is our group at the Capitol building, and then we had the actual teach-in at an adjacent building, the Rayburn congressional building just across the street. And so this teach-in event, so we see featured here is Shelly Simmons. The woman speaking there is the Assistant Director of Civic Engagement for Rock the Vote, which is a digital online platform that was started in the 90s, kind of part of the, I think it was an MTV movement actually in the 90s, and then kind of grew into its own thing after that. Some additional speakers who were present for the teach-in were Tanya Rhodes-Smith, who was an MSW. She's also the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the University of Connecticut. That institute is instrumental in the Voting is Social Work campaign. That national social work voter mobilization campaign began in 2016, and that launched the site votingassocialwork.org. Other speakers included Dr. Michael Reich from the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and Cheryl Aguilar, who is a clinical social worker in the DC area. She works mostly with individuals who have immigrant or refugee status and are currently living in the United States. So according to the Voting is Social Work campaign, nonpartisan voter registration, education, and outreach are legal, ethical, and professional. And absolutely, so just to clear up any confusion about whether or not someone in their role as a professional social worker can be engaging with people at their agencies about voting. The key is to be nonpartisan though with voter registration and outreach. So you can't tell someone to vote for a particular candidate, but you can inform them and educate them on how to research candidates and political parties. Being asked to, something that was talked about extensively at this teach-in was how important it is to, and how powerful it can be to talk to someone about voting, especially if you're in a relationship, a therapeutic relationship, with someone that you trust. So if you have a client that really trusts you, it can be a really powerful motivator to get them thinking about voting and how, if they'll register, when they will register, getting to the polls on election day. NASW CEO Angelo McLean was also present at this teach-in, and he talked about how field placements are a great opportunity for MSW students to really talk to clients about the importance of voting. And like I said, talk to them about deadlines and the actual registration process. Dr. Reich talked about how in 2016, during the presidential election, there were 90 million Americans who were eligible to vote and didn't. That's a huge, huge number. Tanya Rhodes-Smith talked about voter intimidation and how that really played a role in this huge chunk of people who didn't vote. Feeling like they didn't know where to vote, how to vote, who to vote for. People not just knowing who represented them, and how that could make them feel overwhelmed and uninformed. Also, disenfranchisement laws in different states across the country make it possible for about 20 million people to not vote. And those laws can range from, like in Ohio, for example, there's a case before the Supreme Court where the state is being sued because they're flagging people who choose not to vote after the first, in one federal election. So if someone in Ohio is registered to vote, they do not vote in one federal election, the state flags them. And they're not the only state that's practicing that. Georgia, Montana, Oregon, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma are all states that are noting when registered voters do not participate in elections in an attempt to eventually purge voter rolls and make it so that if someone is not using their right to vote, they ultimately will lose that right, which is so it really so it's interesting how at the state level it really individual states can have can really set the tone on how hard or how easy it is for someone to vote. So in North Dakota, for example, you can just show up on election day and vote. If you have an ID, if you have proof, kind of like going to get a library card. If you have an electric bill, you have a copy of your lease, and you have a driver's license, you can vote in North Dakota. In states like Maine and Vermont, if someone is in prison, they can vote. They still have their rights as a voter. which is a stark contrast to Florida, where if there was a case a handful of years ago where a woman was on parole. She'd been on parole, she voted in a local election, trying to re-engage with her community, and that was seen as a violation of parole. She didn't know what her rights were, what the laws were, and she was actually sent back to jail because she violated her parole by voting. So it's just really important to know state by state what the laws are. For example, in New York State, you must be a U.S. citizen or born in Puerto Rico, Guam, or the Virgin Islands. It's interesting how that's worded on the state website where I got this. 18 years or older, or 18 years old at least, not be in prison or on parole for a felony conviction. People on probation are not allowed to vote. Not judged mentally incompetent by a court, and not claim the right to vote anywhere else. So again, just back to what I was saying earlier, Dr. Reich talked about the importance of how a lack of education about voting rights, but also a lack of education on just the structure of government in general, which I will talk about a little bit later on, does affect people and their willingness or interest to vote. At the local level, approximately 1 out of 4 people vote in municipal elections. Dr. Reich talked about how the municipal elections are kind of like the farm teams. Did a lot of like sports analogies during the teaching, and he talked about how that's where political careers often start. So if you have someone who's running in a local election, city election, start as a council person, that's sort of setting the trajectory for a future political career potentially. And that person could rise up to could have a lot of influence in a lot of different ways. So it's really important to pay attention to candidates at a local level. That is often the place too where it's a lot harder to find out information about what a candidate might be in support of. There's frequently less information at the local level. One other thing that came out of discussing, influences that really kind of deter people from voting is feeling this disconnect, this distrust in government. Depending on the status of an individual, they may be concerned about who might have their information, access to their information. They could be living in an environment, in a home where there's mixed status in their family. That might make it a little bit stressful when they think about voting. Shanice Simmons talked about specifically for the millennials. Millennials now make up the largest voting bloc. They've surpassed baby boomers. That being said, in 2016, only 33% of them voted in the presidential election. So there's a lot of power there that wasn't being utilized. Some of that was due to younger people having, perhaps they're away at school, either registered at a permanent address elsewhere, and they become ineligible because of those circumstances to vote. They don't plan ahead enough. They don't request an absentee ballot. And in addition to feeling disconnected and overwhelmed. So that being said, the deadline to register in New York State online and in person, so you can go downtown to the Erie County Board of Elections, that's this Friday the 12th. And then next Wednesday, the 17th, if you mail it in, your registration, that's the last date for that. So those are a couple of really important dates that are coming up. Quickly, I'll add too, so from the voting and social work campaign, there are a number of ways that social workers can encourage awareness and the importance of voting. So alerting social work colleagues that nonpartisan voter mobilization is legal, professional, and important, like I was talking about earlier. We do have handouts of all of these resources for you to take with you, so you don't have to worry about like when I'm talking about digital tools and resources like writing anything down because we've got copies for you. Again, assisting clients and constituents who need extra guidance in registering to vote and getting to the polls. Students can help clients with this information. Macro students, depending on your field placement, can introduce agency policy change, spread the word community campaigns, and organize to get people to the polls on election day. And then professional social workers can invite all candidates running for office in your agency's district to discuss their policy proposals that promote social justice, human rights, and equal opportunity. Let's see. So real quick,
photos from the NSW conference. I didn't take any of these. The NSW took these photos. So this is NASW CEO Angelo McLean, and these are some. So this is. Oh, his name is escaping me. I should have written it down. So he's an educator in Arizona who worked to create this program in his school at a very low resource, low income, in a very low resource, low income area of Phoenix, to go and create a robotics program, and they did a documentary about his program called Underwater Dreams. It's really fascinating. Van Jones and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker were present at the conference. There were a lot of panel discussions, a lot of audience participation. I really like this one. It's just attitude. There was just a lot of connection between panelists and audience members at the conference. Like I said, it was 3 days. There was a lot. Oh, this is me. Required photo that I was there. Proof. I want to show this video really fast. Pat, you mentioned midterm. And I felt like this video, it's a couple of minutes, it really talks about what it says, what's at stake for the midterm elections. I'm just going to play this.
The U.S. midterm elections don't usually get a whole lot of attention outside of the country, but this year is different because whatever happens in November will be seen as a referendum on Donald Trump. Right now, Republicans have the majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but control of Congress is up for grabs. If nothing changes, it means Americans like what they have now and they want more of it. But if Democrats take control of either house, there could be some major changes. For starters, pretty much any Republican legislation would be dead on arrival, and expect more investigations into allegations of corruption, Russia, and Trump's businesses. So how do the midterms work? Let's start with the House. Members serve a 2-year term, so every seat is up for grabs. Right now, Republicans have 236 out of 435 seats. Democrats have 193, and 6 are vacant. One reason Democrats are optimistic, more than 40 Republicans aren't running again, including House Speaker Paul Ryan. Flipping the House is rare. In fact, in the last 25 years, it's only happened 3 times. In 1994, back when Bill Clinton was president, Democrats lost the House. In 2006, it flipped back, partly because of anger with then-President George W. Bush. In 2010, the Tea Party wave handed control back to the Republicans, and they have kept it ever since. What do those 3 flips have in common? Each favored the party not in the White House. The Senate works differently. There are 100 senators, 2 for each state. Republicans have control of the Senate by a paper-thin margin, but it's pretty likely they'll still have control come November. Each senator serves a 6-year term, and elections are staggered. They happen every 2 years, so about a third of the Senate is up for re-election. This year, 35 seats are in play. 26 are held by Democrats or left-leaning independents. 9 are held by Republicans, so the basic math favors Republicans. And 10 of those Democrats are running in states that Trump won and is still popular. So the Senate changing hands could be a long shot, but it's not just Congress that could change. There are 36 governorships up for grabs, and more than 6,000 members of state legislatures will be elected. A record number of women are running for office, most of them Democrats, so the results could be historic. Another thing to watch for in all of this is turnout. Traditionally, more Republicans show up to vote for the midterms than Democrats. Opposition to Donald Trump could change that or not. And then there are concerns about Russia interfering in the election. All of this while the tone is already nasty on both sides and the country is increasingly divided.
So let's move into actual, nitty-gritty of state and local government. Do you want to kind of head up to?
Yeah. Should I?
Yes. I'm going to sit right here.
Okay. Yeah. So, part of what I wanted to talk about was breaking down state, county, and municipal Government, partially because a lot of what we talk about is federal government. When we talk about who's going to be president, we usually talk about who's going to be to the state senate, or excuse me, the federal senate. And I feel like one of the barriers that I hear a lot while I'm working out, well, when I'm talking to people in general about elections, but when we're doing voter registrations, people are saying, I don't know what they do, I don't know anything about that position, I don't know who any of those people are, I don't feel like I can go out and make an educated vote, right? And when we were planning for this, I was talking to Christina about how there's we should have looked up what the study was. There's a study that they asked people if they knew what a bicycle was, if they used a bicycle, if they feel like they're familiar with how a bicycle works. And people said yes, yeah, of course, I know how a bike works. And they then asked them to draw it, and there was a good percentage of people who couldn't actually draw how the bike's mechanisms actually work. So a lot of times there are things that we think we know that we don't actually know. So we know what a senate is, do we know what the state senate does versus what the federal senate does and who each of those people are, and same with assembly and municipal government. So I wanted to have kind of conversation about what each of those positions are, and we could talk about who's in those now, where there are races happening now, but primarily what they do, right? So I brought on the board over here just a list of the basic positions that are held in state, county, and municipal. I know people in the recording can't see it, but it's pretty much state is governor, lieutenant governor, comptroller, attorney general, state senate, state assembly. Excuse my handwriting, I tried really hard. And the ones that I put stars next to are the ones that have an election right now. You'll notice the only one that's not state that has a star next to it is county clerk, because I believe there's a special election, so there's a race for that right now. State and federal elections happen on even years, typically. County municipal elections happen on odd years. So unless there's a special election, which there was, that divide is pretty typical. So does anyone want to tell me what the governor does and what his role is? I say he because we have a he in office right now, but no. Lieutenant governor? Comptroller? Alright. So the best way to think about it is we know basic federal structure, right? We're taught that there's the president, there's the legislative body, and then there's judicial, right? I didn't write too much about judicial up there. There are judges that we vote in. I don't know much about that, if I'm being entirely honest. So I guess my disclaimer that I wanted to put at the very front that I'll say now is I'm not an expert in any way. I will offer any information that I have. I will answer any questions that you have in any way that I can. I won't know all the answers. I will try to help you find them however possible.
Holly,
Yes.
maybe you could, like preface the information you're gonna give us, but
Yeah.
how do you describe your voter engagement work at Council for Economic Justice?
Sure.
Coalition for
Coalition.
Economic
Alright,
Justice.
then I guess I'll back up. Because I got your slide. I got sidetracked, so I just jumped right in. Yeah, so I work for the Coalition for Economic Justice. My job is primarily as a transit riders organizer, so I'm working on a campaign with people who are fighting for improvements in a public system. Part of the organizing model for CEJ, one that we follow, is that power comes from money and people. We typically don't have the money, but we have the people, to put pressure on the people who do have the money and who might have the decision-making power that we don't directly have. The other work that I've done with CEJ is there have been other campaigns that I've worked on. One of them is the Poor People's Campaign, the revival of the Poor People's Campaign. Anyone heard of that earlier this year? That's okay. It's a revival of Martin Luther King's campaign that he was working on when he was assassinated. And there was a 40 days of action that happened earlier this year where people in over 30 states and in DC went to the capitals and risked arrest, performing in actions to bring attention to the 4 pillars of evil. So it's the war economy, poverty, racism, and this iteration of it added ecological devastation, so environmental impact. And a lot of clergy involved, it was a beautiful thing. And it culminated in this rally in DC after the 40 days. And moving from that, the group is now working on voter registration and voter education. So we've been working on going door to door in different parts of the city to get people registered to vote before Friday, when the deadline is up. We will be continuing that work after this election, and I'm always looking for help with that because there are some elections coming up next year that are very important. So part of the reason this work is really, really important to me is that I think a lot of people don't recognize how much power they have in voting. We know, so I also, in my personal life, have been involved in some campaigns. My husband ran for Chief Chihuahua Town Council last year and won, and so I've been a part of the actual campaign process and seeing behind the scenes, for better or worse, in some of those positions. So we know that politicians listen to voters and listen to the people that are voting for them. They have data that shows who's already voted before. Like you said, they flag. People get flagged if they're not active. But even if they're not being flagged, all of the data that's handed out to say you can go to these doors or you should talk to these people say this person votes every year. This person votes every election. They are the person you want to talk to. And they're the person that's most likely to get listened to. They also know what districts people are more likely to be voting for them or not. They know where, like not districts, neighborhoods, I should say. And not that I am suggesting that a politician wouldn't listen to somebody if they're from a neighborhood where where they don't vote for them typically. But there are certain areas that they're more likely to target, and there's certain areas that they're more likely to benefit when making decisions because they know that place is going to reward them. That place typically will vote for them to help them keep their seat, right? I also used to work as a preventative worker. So I used to work with families working with CPS at risk of having their children removed from their home. If I knew any of this information when I was doing that work, I could have said, you know, let's see. Well, if you know that the city council is working on their budget and they're going to be talking about whether or not there's going to be school programs or kids, like children's programs after school, the funding for that's going to be cut, and then your child is no longer going to have that program after school to go to, and you're going to have to find something else to do. If you knew that was happening, you can go and lobby for that and make sure that the people that they hear that the people who are benefiting from that program need that program to stay in place. Or in the other direction, we need you to use some money to create this program because people in our neighborhood are desperate for it, right? But you can't do that if you don't know who you're supposed to be talking to do that, right? So. Basic structure, like I was saying, would be to think of it as the executive, would be on the federal level the president, right? They oversee a lot of things, they can appoint people, they are sort of the manager of the different departments, is one way to look at it. On the state level, that's the governor, the county level, that's the executive, the municipal level, that's the mayor or the town supervisor. It can look different depending on how big your municipal area is or what the structure is there. So there's also lieutenant governor or vice president. They can like oversee. They can sort of like be an assistant in a way that they're overseeing the legislative body in a lot of ways. I don't know if that entirely made sense.
Oh, they're backup.
Backup.
Their backup should the, executive not be able to perform her duties, then this person can step in.
Right.
And also works to promote, for example, the vice president often trots over to Capitol Hill to meet and twist arms instead of the president having to take time out to do that.
Right. And similarly with the lieutenant governor, they are like an overseer. They don't get a vote on the legislative body, but they can be an overseer of it, be sort of like the president of that legislative body. Am I losing you guys? Got it. All right. So the legislative body would be the Senate and the Assembly. On the state level, it's the same. There's a Senate and an Assembly. County, we have county legislators. I believe we have 11. Yes, we have 11 county legislators. And then we have a city council, or like in Cheektowaga, there's a town council, or in other areas there could be a smaller version of that. So they pass bills to create laws. They create programs in that way. They are oftentimes the direct line to the work that you want to do. So in my work, we have Tim Kennedy is one of our state senators. And in our state senate, he has a bill to add 2 riders to people who rely on public transportation to be on the NFTA board, so that there are people who are actually relying on the system involved in the political process and have a direct line to that power. There's also the comptroller at each level, who is pretty much the accountant, I guess. Like they organize the budget in a lot of ways, keep track of the finances, which is a very powerful person, right? So if you were saying, I want money for school programs, you better hope that they'll be willing to help move some of that money, and that the other people above them are willing to support that. There's the Attorney General, who is, in my opinion, a very important race right now, and they, let me pull it because I don't want to say this the wrong way. Right now we've got Barbara Underwood, and the race is between Keith Woodford and Letitia James. But they're kind of like the state level. I apologize. But they oversee all the so when people are calling for investigations into the holding center, the AG are the ones that would be doing that. They oversee all of the judicial law enforcement across the state.
So Division of Human Rights, complaints about discrimination.
Exactly.
All that would go, not to the Attorney General directly, but that division
Right.
deals with violations of human rights.
Right.
The New York State Constitution has a very nice strength and basis to promote human rights, including, the right to vote.
Right. Absolutely.
An additional example too would be the unfortunate incident with Rafael Rivera.
Outside of School 77.
Yes.
Yes.
And how the Attorney General had decided not to investigate.
Correct, because the ruling was that because there was a gun on site, that an investigation wasn't necessary, and there are people fighting that. Yeah. Right. So the other ones are clerks who, at the county level, do things like file birth certificates and issue, death certificates, keep count of population, a lot of tracking paperwork stuff. Sorry. And district attorney is sort of like the Attorney General, but on a local level. So they oversee all the judicial proceedings locally. On the municipal level, a lot of that is very similar. There could be a mayor, there could be a city council, which we have, in which all of the seats are up next year, so that'll be a big election year. A local comptroller, and then there could be a highway supervisor that's elected, or a department of a DPW, a Department of Public Works. So just keeping track of all of those things can be overwhelming, especially if you don't know who all the players are. But even if you're interested, that there is something like healthcare is a big one that comes up. If you're interested in healthcare and in getting a certain kind of healthcare across the state, you would be interested in the state and the assembly races. You want to make sure that the people that you're voting in or that are being voted in are supportive of that idea, right? And the reason I wanted to talk about it was partially what Christina was mentioning earlier, is that access to knowledge is one of the biggest barriers to issues of voting.
Okay, so we have so I don't know if you guys have already seen this. This was a clip that the Tonight Show did recently. Are anybody here familiar with Schoolhouse Rock? Okay, so this was a clip that they did that was kind of a throwback to that with Jimmy Fallon.
It's kind of lighthearted. I also actually want to check in real fast. How's everybody feeling right now? How are we doing?
Good.
Doing okay? Does anybody have any questions about anything right now? So far? Okay. Alright, cool. Well, don't hesitate to, ask if you think of anything.
Hey, Yara.
Oh, hey, Jimmy.
Where are you going?
I'm on my way to Voting Avenue.
Voting Avenue? What's that?
It's a place you get to go when you turn 18. It means you get to vote.
How do you get there?
I'll show you the way.
Who are you?
Well, I'm a ballad, of course. Follow me. So you say that you're 18. Well, I'll tell you what that means. It's an opportunity for something new. You gotta do your civic duty. So go on and shake that booty down the street known as Voting Avenue.
Voting Avenue? That sounds far out.
It is far out, but it's also closer than you think.
I want to know more. Who can go there?
Take it away, ballot.
It don't matter who you are, if you walk or drive a car. It don't make a difference if you're red or blue. It's Shahidi, Mr. Ballot. Come with me and singing ballad, and we'll take a stroll down Voting Avenue.
So what do you think, Jimmy?
I think I'm going to like Voting Avenue. Can we go?
Sure. All you gotta do is register. Go online to vote.gov or just say, Siri, how do I vote?
Here's how to buy a goat.
Siri.
To complete your registration, just fill out an application. It's as easy as 2 plus 2. Then you're making your selection, taking part in your election. That's how you cruise down Voting Avenue.
But the presidential election doesn't happen until 2020. Why are we singing about this now?
There's an election every year, Jimmy, and state and local elections can be just as important, if not more.
Well, what would I even vote on?
Well, since you asked, there's...
Legislators, governors, and senators as well.
You can vote for your state animal to be the gazelle.
Vote for greener policies if you're a fan of trees.
And vote to ban vegetables if you hate peas.
You can vote for judges, you can also vote for mayors.
You can write in anybody like Jack McBrayer.
Whether women's issues, weed or water or a wall, the best thing about voting is that voting has it all.
Wow, voting is amazing.
Well, does it make you want to sing about it?
It sure does.
Then be my guest.
It really is the trouble. Now I'm filling out these bubbles. It couldn't be a simpler thing to do. From New York to Sacramento, every lady, every gentleman should make their way down Voting Avenue. So don't miss the possibility to take part in your democracy. Come join us here on Voting Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
Alright. That's cute. Just lighten things up. Okay, actually, real quick, I want to pull up that list of, so we were talking about voting and social work. Sorry, I'm gonna pull this up before we started. So on that list of resources that we will give you, this is where I want to go, yes, online tools. So this has a list of online resources, and again, this is nonpartisan, so you can absolutely use this. The only thing that I do know is that TurboVote is not free. I think for if someone is like an agency and they want to use it, but other than that, like you can still go on and find out information. Sentencing Project, this is more about if you're interested in learning about how like criminal justice, things about felony rights, like there's a ton of information on that resource. It's just a really great way. You can print this out to hand off to someone. If you're feeling intimidated about engaging with someone about voting because you don't know, you're not an expert, you don't know everything about about voting, it's just a really nice thing to be able to hand off to someone as a resource. There's a lot to know, and there's something that they talked about a lot during that voter engagement teach-in is just how the power of everyone's voice, the power of everyone to be able to connect and share, why it's important to make sure that the rights of people and their ability to make their voices heard stay, honored and stay important.
Okay, so let's talk about, real quick, because I know we're starting to run low on time. Would anyone like to share some of their experience as a voter, whether it be voting in an election personally, any sort of voting, voter engagement that might be happening at your field placements right now, any previous work that you've done with voting, or stuff that you've observed that you felt like really worked or really didn't. Does anyone want to share any experiences that they've had? If you don't, that's okay. If you need a minute, that's fine. Yes.
I had the misfortune to work on campaigns where the person lost, but primarily because it was contested districts, and for example, the one Chris Collins holds now had a very vibrant, had a very good candidate, a woman for his Democrat, and just, lost. So, but however, even working on a losing campaign, as it were, I learned more about the area, Amherst, east to Rochester, about what the issues were, about how in certain districts, maybe you don't want to bring up the candidate's support for legal and safe abortions the first thing when you're doing phone banking, this sort of thing. So, and you get to know people, who are going to be future candidates too. So that's what I put in as my experience.
I know, so my field placement last year, again, I was at OCFS in the Division of Juvenile Justice and Opportunities for Youth. One of the front desk staff had voter registration information taped to her desk. And a lot of times you'll see at front desk, there's not a lot of space. And what she did was she had this really clever way of, she had it sort of hanging from the front. All the information, so for example, and I don't think that I mentioned this, in New York State, as long as you give, I think it's 10 days or 2 weeks notice to your employer, you are legally allowed to leave work for 2 hours on election day to vote if you don't have time to do it before or after work. The state, you were allowed to do that. So she had all that information kind of hanging from different parts of her desk, so it was all there. She would engage with anyone who was interested about voter information, and I thought that was really great because I don't think I had seen that before. I had asked, so I'm currently at Bethel Behavioral Health. I'm at their Southtowns location. We out of the office provide services mostly to youth and families. So I did bring it up to someone at Self Behavioral Health who said she'd get back to me about the possibility of doing more voter engagement. Although there was the initial question of, but it's all kids, it's all people who are under the age of 18. Yes, but their family, guardians who are bringing them in. So it really, even just by asking my field educator about it and bringing up this voting and social work site and some of the resources to her, it really kind of got the conversation going about that, which is cool.
You can register at 17 in New York as long as you'll be 18 before the end of the year.
So one of the last things that we wanted to talk about today is just the importance of self-care. So this was another video that I thought was really great, but I didn't want to play because I was like, I can't have presentation on 3 videos, and I think that I want to give the presentation on 3 videos all the time. So if you go to YouTube, I think it's called How to Adult is the channel, and there's a self-care action plan, a couple minutes long, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So as you probably know, the School of Social Work had a great little handout that was the importance of social work of self-care in social work. And a lot of the tips that we've talked about, I think every class, it talks about self-care in one capacity or another, is absolutely applicable to both your personal and professional, the ways that voting and the climate of the election season can impact you both personally and professionally. So in, to that, something that Cheryl Aguilar from the voter engagement team at DC talked about was just the importance of honoring where you are. Like if you are at an agency where you've got a huge caseload, there's a lot of demands that are placed on you, and you're just got so much on your plate. Don't beat yourself up that you can't go to a rally downtown, or don't beat yourself up that you're not, out working at a phone bank, or just honor where you're at, and find those small ways that you can connect with others about the importance of voting. You really support those causes and issues, or just educate yourself about things to really, you're doing enough. Just kind of give yourself a little bit of a break, some self-compassion. The other thing that she talked about too was how, professional peer consultation at your agency, if you're a clinician, is another way, or if you're an MSW student and you're receiving supervision, weekly supervision, talk about voting with your supervisor. Talk about the stress you might be perceiving, the stress that is causing for the clients that you're interacting with, and if you're perceiving that stress, in how the stress of the climate of a political season might be affecting them. You can talk about those things with your supervisor as well. So I think that's pretty much. I don't know. Does anybody else have any self-care tips that they use? I know for me sometimes, and I did it this morning. I will totally admit to it. I try to listen to NPR. I know not partisan, but I listen to NPR. So this is me talking about me and my own personal way of doing self-care. So I like to listen to NPR in the morning, or I'll try and check out the New York Times or something. And this morning I just had to turn it off. It's just I can't right now. Tonight, at some point today, I'll check the headlines. I'll do something to just sort of gauge your ability to sort of take things in. And again, self-compassion. Give yourself a break. You don't have to listen to the streaming of CNN and all the headlines. You're doing enough. Feel like you need to take a little bit of a break because you feel overwhelmed. Does anybody have any tips that they use related to social media or the news? Now that we're in the home stretch of the election season, to kind of help you stay sane, Holly?
I used to have a supervisor that when she was overwhelmed or stressed, especially about the news, she was in Collins District. She would call his office to advocate for something, and then she would call Colin's office to advocate for something, to talk about the kind of changes that she wanted to see, and she would feel better afterwards because she felt like she was actually engaging in the process. But I think and our intern last year said that for him sometimes self-care meant actually working on the stuff that he needed to get done, because a lot of times we talk about the need to step away from things, but if you're constantly stressed about those things, you're not really able to be mindful on what you're focusing on instead. So he said sometimes self-care meant actually getting that work done, which was an interesting idea. Not something I hear very often.
How about questions for Christina or Holly?
Oh, I forgot to update. That's what I was going to do this morning. Okay, sorry about that.
It's all good. I think the cat makes it.
Yeah, right. Cats make things better.
So it's Holly at
Buffalo.org.
CEJbuffalo.org.
You want to put that on here real fast? Okay,
Sure.
Okay.
I'll give you one.
Good.
Okay. Yeah, does anybody have any questions while fixing the slide I should have fixed this morning? Sorry about that.
Buffalo.org.
Perfect.
Just the
And-
Y at the end of it.
Holly.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh my gosh. You're good. Okay.
Good. And how about now that we're a month out from the midterms? I mean, are things escalating for you, Holly? Or this is just, we know what we need to do, we're continuing the door-to-door?
We do continue door to door. We are going to be out Thursday at 5:15. We will be at 322 Amherst to start getting people out to do a last push for voter registration. You go out in teams, so you wouldn't be going door to door by yourself. The thing about New York is that since we are primaries locally are extremely important. A lot of the areas people tend to think well, that area is blue, so it'll always go blue. So sometimes people won't pay attention after the primary. It's still just as important to make sure we do a push, make sure those people get in. We did mention earlier they are closed primaries, so you have to be registered in a party in order to vote in the primary. And the Independence Party does not mean that you're independent, it does not mean you're unaffiliated. It is a party that is of its own thing, which is very important to tell people.
And some parties do not hold primaries, right? I mean, like Working Families or the Green Party and so forth don't hold primaries because they're sometimes not contested, right?
Right. And just because an area is typically blue or typically red, doesn't tell you as much as you might think it does. So in Cheektowaga, they're very conservative Democrats that are typically winning. So the Democrats are usually the ones that win on a local level, but the conservative line is one of the most important third-party lines. So the person who wins the conservative line is usually one of the top winners. So it could be really interesting to look at how the parties play differently in different areas.
And I'll give a plug, I'll come on camera here. So please be aware that UB sponsors three different trips for students. First, in March, Social Work Month, we hire a bus to transport students down and back the same day for, Legislative Education and Advocacy Day. And it's sponsored by NASW. The second is, if you are a foundation year student and you are interested in political office or working on a campaign and you have some dedication and maybe even some experience, there's a boot camp that's, costs over $1,000 to train in Washington, D.C. And I have sponsored a student for that. And then thirdly, there's United Nations Day, Social Work Day at the United Nations that we fund one or two students for, reimburse you for travel expenses and so forth. So, on an international level, a state level, and a federal level, we're doing what we can to prepare our students to go forth and practice voting as social work through voter engagement. And if that's all, yes?
I think so, yeah.
Great.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, you guys, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.